The night my daughter-in-law slapped me in front of 130 guests, I didn't raise my hand, I raised the truth. By sunrise, the woman they called a fragile widow had taken back everything they tried to steal, including her dignity. If you're watching this, take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? We love knowing how far these stories of justice and courage are reaching around the world. The slap didn't feel real at first. It was like the sound reached me before the pain did a sharp, echoing crack that sliced through the ballroom's music and froze every single guest where they stood. My glasses flew from my face, landing somewhere near the foot of the stage, shattering into pieces that caught the light from the chandelier like tiny sparks of betrayal. For a moment, there was no sound, no air, no time, just the unbearable silence of 130 people watching an old woman lose her dignity in public. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should pick up my glasses before someone stepped on them. It was the only thing that kept me from collapsing. Then her voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "That's what you get for being so selfish," Sabrina spat, her words trembling with rage, her flawless bridal makeup beginning to crack at the corners of her mouth. "You've had your life, Eleanor. It's our turn now." I blinked at her through a blur of broken glass and disbelief. My daughter-in-law on her own wedding day had just slapped me across the face for refusing to hand over the keys to my home. The guests stood motionless, their smiles frozen mid-gesture, their champagne glasses half raised. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the click of someone's heels retreating, the whisper of someone else muttering, "Did she just—" My cheek burned, but that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was seeing my son, my only child, standing beside her in his black tuxedo, his head bowed, saying nothing. Eric couldn't even meet my eyes. Not a word of defense, not a step in my direction, just that hollow, cowardly silence that screamed louder than any insult could. I crouched down, trembling, and reached for the broken lenses that had scattered across the marble floor. I could see my reflection fractured in each piece, my face, aged but still strong, my eyes, wet but not defeated. The room around me seemed to pulse with embarrassment, pity, and a hunger for gossip. People looked away, pretending not to see, as though witnessing my humiliation was a crime they didn't want to be caught committing. When I stood, the sting on my skin had already begun to fade, replaced by something far colder, a clarity that cut straight to the soul. That slap was more than anger. It was a revelation. A reminder of everything I had chosen not to see for years. For 2 years, I had ignored the little comments, the quiet digs, the smiles that carried poison behind their sweetness. "At your age," Sabrina had said once, "you should think about moving somewhere easier to manage." At my age, those words had followed me like a ghost. I had told myself she didn't mean harm. I had told myself Eric loved me too much to ever let her cross the line. I had told myself that kindness would be enough to keep the peace. But in that moment, standing in the center of that glittering room, the truth became impossible to ignore. I had been living in a story I didn't write. A story where everyone else decided what an old woman was worth. I looked around the ballroom, the white tablecloths, the towering flower arrangements, the champagne bubbles rising like tiny lies. All of it had been paid for, in part, by me. I knew that. They didn't. They thought I was just a quiet widow scraping by on her pension, living in a small condominium that happened to be in a valuable part of town. They had no idea that every inch of their dream wedding was being held together by the invisible thread of my generosity. And yet, in their eyes, I was a burden. Something outdated. Something in the way. Sabrina turned back to her guests, her voice regaining its brittle confidence. "You're not welcome here anymore," she said, her tone theatrical, as if performing for the cameras that some guests had already raised. "Eric and I need our privacy now. We'll make better use of that apartment than someone who barely leaves it." Her words landed harder than the slap. The murmur that followed was a mix of shock and morbid fascination. People love tragedy, especially when it isn't theirs. Some looked at me with pity, others with quiet judgment, as if being old and alone somehow made this humiliation less tragic, more expected. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I simply walked toward the exit, one slow step after another, my heels clicking against the marble like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Behind me, I could still hear the faint music start again, the sound of laughter attempting to fill the space I left behind. Outside, the air was cooler. The night smelled of rain and roses. My hands shook as I reached for the railing at the ballroom stairs. It wasn't from fear. It was from realization. That slap had been the final punctuation in a story I had been too gentle to end myself. I thought of Richard, my late husband, and the secret we had guarded for decades, our wealth, our investments, our choice to live quietly. Visible wealth attracts problems, he used to say. Invisible wealth gives you freedom. He had been right, and tonight his wisdom would become my weapon. I pulled my phone from my purse, an old, scratched thing that looked as tired as people assumed I was, and dialed a number I hadn't used in a long time. "Samuel," I said when he answered. "It's Eleanor. I need you to come to the Royal Gardens ballroom. Right now. Bring the documents we discussed." There was a pause on the line. "Eleanor, are you sure?" His voice was steady but cautious. "I've never been more sure," I replied. "It's time they all learned the truth." As I hung up, I felt the night air press against my skin, cool and electric. Inside the ballroom, the music rose again, violins and laughter, a celebration built on deception. I straightened my shoulders and stared at the golden light spilling through the windows, at the shadows of the people who had just watched me break. In 30 minutes, those same people would watch something else, something unforgettable. They thought the slap had ended the story. They had no idea it had only just begun. If you're watching this video and this story moved something inside you, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful, real-life stories that remind us all how dignity, justice, and courage can change everything. Now, let's think together for a moment. Sometimes in life, when people humiliate or betray you publicly, what do you think is the better response? A. Stay silent to keep peace and avoid conflict. B. Stand up, even if it means standing alone. Tell me your choice, A or B, in the comments below. I'm truly curious how you'd handle it if you were in Eleanor's place. People often assume that silence means weakness, but in my case, silence had always been a form of armor. After that night in the ballroom, as I sat alone in my car staring at the reflection of my swollen cheek in the rearview mirror, I realized how much of my life had been defined by discretion. For decades, I had worn humility like a carefully tailored garment, modest, quiet, and perfectly fitted to the woman I had chosen to appear to be. What no one knew was that beneath that unassuming fabric, my real life, the one Richard and I had built together, was stitched with strength, sacrifice, and a deliberate secret. When Richard was alive, we had agreed to live modestly, even when the numbers in our accounts told a very different story. He used to say, "Eleanor, wealth isn't what you show, it's what you protect." He believed that privacy was the purest form of security. It wasn't fear that drove us to hide it, it was wisdom. We had both grown up during times when people measured worth by what they could display: houses too large for comfort, cars they barely needed, vacations that were more about envy than joy. We wanted none of that. So while others climbed ladders for recognition, Richard and I built walls for peace. Our home was small but filled with meaning. The couch with a tear on the right armrest was where we spent our Sunday mornings reading together. The chipped coffee table was where he'd once written the first proposal for the import company that would quietly make us millionaires. Every modest piece of furniture had a hidden story of effort and shared dreams. That was why I never changed them, even after his passing. People like Sabrina saw worn wood and faded fabric. I saw history. I saw a life that had been enough. After Richard died, I followed his example. I lived in that same condominium, shopped at the same neighborhood store, kept the same old car that coughed a little every winter. To the world, I became that harmless widow who volunteered at the library 3 afternoons a week and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. It wasn't an act of poverty, it was an act of protection. I wanted peace, not admiration. Sabrina never understood that. The first time she visited, her smile faltered when she walked through the door. "It's cozy," she'd said, with that careful politeness that barely covered her disdain. Her eyes didn't stop moving, taking inventory of every simple detail as if my living room were a second-hand store display. I remember the way she turned to Eric and said, "Your mom must really love minimalism." That was her way of saying I wasn't enough. But what she couldn't know, what no one could, was that my simplicity wasn't weakness. It was armor, sharpened over years of watching how people behave when they smell money. My husband and I had seen relatives destroy each other over inheritance, neighbors sabotage each other over envy. We had made a promise: no one would ever know the full extent of what we had. After he passed, I continued the charade alone. When people asked about my finances, I'd smile and talk about my little pension. When friends worried about my car, I'd laugh and say it had character. Even my son never saw the bank statements or the safe deposit keys. It wasn't that I didn't trust him, it was that I wanted him to grow independent, not entitled. But as the years went on, I began to sense the shift in him. He became more preoccupied with appearances. The clothes grew more expensive, the vacations longer, the tone in his voice subtly impatient when I offered advice. Then came Sabrina, beautiful, ambitious, and with a charm that hid something harder beneath. She knew how to perform empathy like a trained actress. "You shouldn't be alone so much, Eleanor," she'd tell me, her tone full of practiced concern. "It's not safe for someone your age." Each word sounded like kindness, but it wasn't. It was strategy, slow erosion disguised as care. I could feel it happening, but I convinced myself it was love. That's what mothers do. We explain away the signs until it's too late. Looking back, I see how deliberately I let myself become invisible. I thought invisibility meant safety. Instead, it turned me into an easy target. I made myself so small that no one remembered how much space I used to fill. I thought blending into the background would protect me from greed. I was wrong. It only made the greedy bolder. That night in the ballroom, when Sabrina slapped me and called me selfish, I saw the irony clearly. The woman who had spent her life building an identity around restraint was now being accused of greed by the very people who had lived off her quiet generosity. My modesty had been the stage on which they built their arrogance. As I sat there in my car, the city lights flickering through the windshield, I thought of the apartment that had become my refuge and their obsession. They saw it as real estate square footage, market value, a ticket out of their debts. I saw it as sacred ground, the last place Richard had kissed my forehead goodnight. I realized then that the time for pretending was over. If I kept living as a ghost of my own life, they would erase me completely. Richard's voice came back to me that night as if he were sitting beside me. "Invisible wealth gives you power," he'd said, "but only if you know when to make it visible." That was the moment I decided to stop hiding. My modesty had protected my fortune. Now it was time for it to protect my dignity. The Eleanor they thought they knew, the timid widow in discount shoes, was gone. The woman who remained was the one who had once built an empire beside her husband and could dismantle an illusion with a single signature. As I closed my eyes and let the city's noise fade, I understood something new about silence. Silence isn't always noble. Sometimes silence is complicity. And for the first time in years, I was ready to make some noise. I started the car, feeling the vibration beneath my hands, steady and alive. The night stretched ahead like a path I hadn't walked in decades. My heart ached for the years lost to restraint, but it also burned with the clarity of purpose. They thought I was powerless because I didn't fight back. They thought humility meant weakness. They forgot that humility without boundaries turns into surrender. That would change tonight. I wasn't going to scream or curse or humiliate them back. No, I was going to do what Richard and I had always done: best plan, act, and let the results speak for themselves. Tomorrow, when Sabrina woke up, the same woman she called old and fragile would be the one who pulled the ground out from under her. The night air was sharp, almost cleansing. As I whispered to no one but myself, "They have mistaken peace for submission. It's time to remind them who I am." And as I drove toward home, toward the place that had been both my shelter and my silence, I finally felt it, the return of something I had buried long ago. Power, but not the loud kind. The quiet, deliberate kind that changes everything once it's set in motion. I first met Sabrina on a spring afternoon that smelled faintly of lilacs and rain. Eric had called the night before, his voice trembling with excitement, saying he wanted me to meet someone very special. He arrived the next day with her, dressed in a pale pink coat that looked like it had been chosen not just to flatter her but to signal refinement. The moment she stepped into my apartment, I knew something was off. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were busy. They darted across the room like hands touching invisible price tags, my curtains, my lamp, the faded photograph of Richard and me on the mantel. "What a charming little place," she said, the word little resting in her mouth like a crumb she couldn't swallow. I had met her kind before, people who wore politeness as camouflage. Still, I smiled, offered her tea, and told myself I was being overly cautious. Eric looked at her as if she were sunlight itself. He'd always been so open-hearted, so eager to see goodness in others. That was his greatest virtue, and perhaps his most dangerous flaw. During dinner, I watched the two of them exchange glances full of silent promises, the kind young couples make when they still believe love alone can build a future. She laughed easily, touched his arm often, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being quietly measured. The evening passed with small talk and compliments, but there were cracks in the charm. When I asked about her work, she gave a vague answer about consulting in image and lifestyle management. When I asked where she grew up, her tone tightened. "Everywhere," she said lightly, as if her past were a dress she'd long outgrown. After dessert, she excused herself to the bathroom. On her way, she paused by the framed photograph of our old house, the one Richard and I had sold when we decided to downsize. I saw her reflection in the glass, her eyes narrowing, calculating. She didn't see me watching. From that night on, every visit carried a weight that wasn't there before. She began to make suggestions, each one dressed as concern. "You shouldn't be alone so much, Eleanor," she'd say. "Eric worries about you. Maybe it's time to think about something smaller, something easier." Sometimes she'd pick up my old teacups, turning them between her fingers as though deciding their worth. She'd smile, always with that same softness that never reached her eyes, and then place them down a little too carefully, as if afraid they might infect her with age. Eric followed her lead without realizing it. I noticed how his sentences began to change. "Sabrina thinks you'd be happier near people your age," he'd tell me. "She's just trying to help." He said it like a child repeating lines from a script. I wanted to believe he meant well, but the tone was wrong. There was hesitation in his voice, as if the words didn't quite fit him, but he couldn't find his own anymore. Their visits became less about spending time together and more about planting ideas. "There's a new senior residence not far from here," Sabrina mentioned one evening, flipping through a brochure she'd conveniently brought along. "You'd have your own suite, meals prepared, medical staff on site, such peace of mind." I smiled politely, but inside something began to tighten. Her voice carried that gentle insistence that isn't persuasion but preparation. She wasn't suggesting, she was rehearsing. It didn't stop there. Soon came the comments about my clothes. "You always wear such practical things," she said, eyes lingering on my sweater. "It's admirable, really. Not many women your age care so little about appearances." Then it was my car. "That old thing? It must be dangerous by now." And finally, my job at the library. "Don't you ever think of resting, Eleanor? At your age, you deserve to relax." Every word sounded like kindness, but every word was an erasure, a subtle rewriting of who I was. People think emotional abuse comes with shouting, but it rarely does. It comes dressed as advice, wrapped in affection, layered with implication. You start doubting your instincts. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You smile to keep peace, not realizing you're slowly disappearing. That's what happened to me. I let her voice replace my own. It was the afternoon of Eric's birthday that the truth first surfaced in its rawest form. We were at my dining table, a small cake between us, when Sabrina leaned forward and said, "Eric and I were talking about your future." My future, those two words chilled me. "You have such a beautiful apartment in such a valuable neighborhood," she continued. "It would make a perfect start for us. You could find somewhere cozier, maybe closer to other seniors. Everyone would feel safer that way." Eric nodded, eyes down, pretending to inspect his fork. In that moment, something shifted. The woman who had built her life on quiet grace felt something new, rage, cold and clean. I didn't show it. I only said, "That's very thoughtful of you, Sabrina. I'll consider it." She smiled, believing she'd won. She had no idea that my consideration meant calculation. That night, I stood in my bedroom staring at the framed photo of Richard again. "You were right," I whispered. "Visible wealth attracts problems. He would have seen through her sooner." I thought about the countless little things I'd ignored, the way she always asked about property values, the way she mentioned her friends' investment opportunities, the way she'd once said, "It's such a waste, living alone in a place like this." I realized then that I was no longer dealing with a petty manipulator. I was dealing with a strategist. From then on, I began to watch her as she had watched me. Every visit became a lesson in observation. I noticed how she handled her phone calls, always stepping into the kitchen to speak in a lowered voice. Once, while Eric was in the shower, I heard her say, "Yes, Mom, her place is perfect. Don't worry, I'm working on it." My heart pounded, but I stayed still. When she came back, she smiled and asked if I wanted more tea. I began keeping a notebook. Every remark, every suggestion, every visit went into it. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was instinct, maybe survival. But deep down, I knew where this road was leading. I'd seen enough people lose everything to charming thieves wearing wedding rings. I wasn't about to join them. By the time their engagement was announced, I had already stopped hoping that things would improve. Sabrina's affection had turned possessive. She spoke of my home as if it were a gift waiting to be claimed. Eric's visits without her became rare, and when they happened, he seemed distracted, restless. "She's just stressed about the wedding," he said when I confronted him gently about her behavior. But his eyes avoided mine. He was lying, and he knew that I knew. That was the moment I stopped seeing Sabrina as a guest and started seeing her as an opponent, not an equal one yet, but dangerous nonetheless. She believed she understood me, that my quietness meant fear, that my politeness meant surrender. She didn't realize that every smile I gave her was a mask, every nod an acknowledgement of the game we were playing. I didn't yet know how it would end, but I knew this much. The battle for my home had already begun, and I intended to win not with shouting, but with patience, not with anger, but with truth. Because the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing left to lose, and I had already lost enough. When the first signs of trouble appeared, they came softly, disguised as kindness. I had lived long enough to know that evil rarely arrives with noise. It slips in through small favors and gentle smiles. It was around late autumn when I started noticing inconsistencies in Eric and Sabrina's conversations. They spoke too quickly when I asked about their work, too vaguely when I inquired about the wedding budget. At first, I blamed myself for being suspicious. But intuition, I've learned, is an older woman's inheritance. It whispers the truth when politeness tells you to look away. One rainy evening, after they had left my apartment, I stared at the half-empty wine glasses on the table and replayed their words. Sabrina had mentioned that the caterer required an early deposit. Eric had looked uneasy. I offered to help, as any mother would, but they both declined too quickly. That night, I decided to verify things quietly. The next morning, I called my friend Marion, a real estate broker who knew the city's financial currents better than anyone. "Marion," I said, trying to sound casual, "could you check if Eric and Sabrina have taken any recent loans? I don't need details, just a sense." She hesitated but agreed. The results came 2 days later. Her tone said it all before her words did. "Eleanor, they're drowning. Unpaid credit cards, 2 overdue rent notices, and a wedding financed almost entirely on borrowed money." Marion's sigh trembled through the phone line. "They even tried to use your address on one of the loan applications. I stopped the agent before it went through." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I sat by the window, watching rain trail down the glass, each drop catching the reflection of a streetlight. My son, my only child, was sinking, and instead of asking for help, he was preparing to pull me down with him. That same week, I discovered the full shape of their desperation. A friend at the local bank, Mr. Lynn, called me discreetly. "Mrs. Parker," he said, Your son visited us yesterday. He asked about the process of taking a loan, using your condominium as collateral." My pulse quickened. "Did he have my permission papers?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "No, ma'am," he replied. "That's why I called you." He hesitated before adding, "He seemed uninformed. I think he's being influenced." I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling. That night, I walked through every room of my apartment, as if seeing it for the first time. Each piece of furniture, every book and photograph, was a chapter of my life. And yet, to them, it was just collateral, something to trade, something to sign away. I had worked too hard to build this sanctuary. Richard and I had poured years into making it debt-free. We had refused every temptation to expand or upgrade. Now, our son was preparing to gamble it away for appearances: a larger wedding, a fancier car, a woman who saw my home not as a place of memories, but as a financial opportunity. The realization broke something inside me, but it also awakened something older and fiercer. I could forgive disrespect. I could forgive cruelty. But I could not forgive the betrayal of intent, the quiet plotting behind my back. So I began to collect information. I kept a folder labeled simply records. Into it went everything: receipts, bank statements, property deeds, and notes from conversations. Not out of paranoia, but preparation. A week later, I invited Eric to lunch. He arrived late, smelling faintly of cologne and anxiety. We sat at the small Italian cafe where we used to celebrate his birthdays when he was a boy. I asked about the wedding, about work, about his plans. He answered each question with the same rehearsed vagueness. Finally, I placed my cup down and said, "Eric, did you try to use my apartment for a loan?" His face paled. "Who told you that?" he said too quickly. "So you did," I replied quietly. "You know that property is in my name only." He opened his mouth, closed it, then sighed. "Mom, listen. It's just, we're under a lot of pressure. Sabrina's parents expect a certain standard. The wedding's already in motion." I thought. "You thought what?" I interrupted, keeping my voice steady. "That I wouldn't find out, that my name, my home, could be a solution to your debts?" He looked at me then, truly looked, and for the first time in years, I saw fear not of me, but of what I represented: accountability. "It's not like that," he whispered. "Sabrina said it was temporary." Temporary. Such a small word for such a large betrayal. I took a deep breath and reached across the table, not in anger but in finality. "Eric," I said softly, "you're my son, and I will always wish you well. But understand this: the moment you use my trust as a tool, you lose the right to it." He didn't answer. He looked away, his jaw tight, his hands fidgeting with his napkin. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. When he finally stood to leave, he kissed my cheek automatically, like habit, and walked out. I watched him disappear into the crowd, my heart breaking not from what he had done, but from what he was becoming. That night, I sat at my desk under the dim light of Richard's old lamp. I reread our old letters, promises of a future built on honesty, modesty, and patience. Richard had once written, "Money tests the soul. The poor fear not having it. The wealthy fear losing it, but the wise fear what it does to love." I understood that line differently now. I began drafting a plan, quiet but deliberate. If they wanted to play with paperwork, I would master the language of it. If they wanted to hide their motives behind politeness, I would answer with precision. I contacted Samuel, my financial advisor, and told him to prepare updates on all accounts. I asked him to create a record trail that proved every cent was in my control. "You're expecting trouble?" he asked gently. "No," I replied. "I'm expecting clarity." By the time I finished, dawn had begun to touch the sky with that pale gray light that always feels like both ending and beginning. I walked to the window, the city below still quiet, and whispered, "Richard, they think I'm fragile. They've mistaken kindness for blindness. But they'll learn." That day marked the beginning of something irreversible. Betrayal has a way of purifying love. It burns away illusion and leaves only truth behind. And the truth was simple. I could no longer be their safety net. From that moment on, I wasn't just a mother trying to protect her child. I was a woman reclaiming what was hers, her name, her peace, her boundaries. And if they forced me into battle, I would not fight with anger, but with evidence. Because nothing terrifies the deceitful more than a woman who knows exactly what she owns and exactly what she's worth. It happened 3 months before the wedding, on a quiet Sunday morning that began with coffee and ended with betrayal. I had been sitting by the window, reading the paper, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel outside my apartment. Through the curtains I saw Eric's car pulling in. But it wasn't just him this time. Sabrina was with him, of course, and behind them, another vehicle followed. When the door opened, I saw 2 strangers stepping out, a well-dressed couple who looked far too polished for an unannounced visit. Sabrina waved at me with that bright, brittle smile that always meant trouble. "Mom, we brought guests," she called cheerfully. The guests turned out to be her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Grant. He was a tall man with the kind of firm handshake meant to intimidate. She wore pearls at 10 in the morning, and a perfume that filled the room before she even entered it. They sat on my couch as if auditioning for an etiquette commercial, smiling with practiced warmth. "We've heard so much about you, Eleanor," Mrs. Grant said. "Sabrina just adores you." I forced a polite smile, even as unease twisted in my stomach. Sabrina sat beside Eric, her hand resting possessively on his knee. "We wanted to talk about something important," she said. "It's about your future and ours." I listened as they began their well-rehearsed speech. Mrs. Grant went first, her tone syrupy but deliberate. "Eleanor, you've done so much for Eric. Truly, it's inspiring. But we worry about you living alone at your age. You deserve comfort and safety." "Mr." Grant chimed in smoothly. "There's a beautiful senior residence not far from here, 5-star amenities, medical support, everything you could want. Sabrina and Eric have found a perfect suite for you." He reached into a leather folder and slid a brochure across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. My fingers stayed clasped around my coffee cup, which suddenly felt too warm in my hands. Sabrina leaned forward, her voice a soft imitation of concern. "It would be the best solution for everyone. You'd have company, and we could take care of the apartment for you. It's a valuable property too big for one person. You could sell it or rent it out. Eric and I could help with the process." Her eyes glittered when she said, "valuable." That was the moment I understood what this visit truly was, an ambush dressed as love. I looked at my son. He avoided my gaze, pretending to straighten his tie. "Eric," I said quietly, "do you agree with this?" He swallowed hard. "Mom, we're just trying to make sure you're safe. Sabrina's parents have experience with these things. It's for your own good." The phrase "for your own good" has a way of freezing the blood. I placed my cup down carefully, afraid that if I didn't, it might shatter in my hand. Mr. Grant pulled out another paper, this one not glossy but official. "If you decide to move, we could handle all the arrangements. We even consulted a lawyer about simplifying the property transfer process. It's very straightforward. All you'd need is your signature." He said it lightly, as though he were asking me to sign a birthday card. I saw the notary stamp at the bottom, half hidden under his thumb. Something inside me went utterly still. The world seemed to slow around me, the tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the nervous rustle of Sabrina's dress. I could feel Richard's presence then, as if he were standing behind me, silent but watchful. He had warned me once that power never asks, it assumes. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made Sabrina's confidence waver. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm not ready to leave my home, Mrs." Grant's expression tightened, just for a second. "Eleanor, we only want what's best for you. It's not safe for a woman your age to live alone. Accidents happen." She said it with the polished tone of someone who thinks manipulation sounds like kindness. Sabrina chimed in, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, Mom, don't make this hard. We're trying to help." And then Eric, my son, the boy I had carried through sleepless nights and scraped knees, added softly, "If you won't do this willingly, we might have to consider other options." The room fell silent. The sentence lingered between us like smoke. "Other options," I repeated slowly, tasting the threat in it. Sabrina's parents exchanged glances. Eric tried to backtrack. "I just mean we'd have to talk to someone about what's best for you. Maybe legal advice, maybe a doctor's evaluation. You know, just to make sure you're okay." It was the first time I heard the word unspoken but implied. Guardianship. They were already plotting to take control of my life, my choices, my freedom. I leaned back and looked at each of them in turn. "I see," I said. "You've all gone to a lot of trouble to plan my future. How considerate of you." My tone was calm, almost gentle, but every syllable carried the weight of ice. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like some air." I stood, walked to the window, and opened it wide. The breeze rushed in, cool and sharp. I didn't turn around when I said, "This conversation is over. My home is not for sale, my mind is not for question, and my life is not your project." Sabrina rose from the couch, her voice breaking. "Mom, why are you being so difficult?" "Because," I said, finally facing her, "I've seen where help like yours leads." Eric looked at me with a mixture of frustration and shame. "You're making a mistake." "No," I replied quietly. "I'm correcting one." They left soon after, though not without protest. The front door closed behind them with a sound that felt like both ending and warning. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space they'd occupied, the untouched brochure, the papers still on the table, the faint smell of perfume lingering in the air. Then I picked up the document they had left behind. My name was already printed on it, underlined neatly. They had come expecting my compliance, not my refusal. As I tore the paper into careful strips, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. Their plan had revealed itself fully now, not just greed, but entitlement. They didn't see me as a person anymore, but as an obstacle between them and comfort. That night I called Samuel, my advisor, and told him everything. "They're preparing something legal," I said. "Get ready." He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Understood." When I hung up, I walked to my bedroom, opened the drawer where I kept Richard's old watch, and wound it for the first time in years. Its ticking filled the quiet like a heartbeat returning. It was in that moment I made myself a promise. They could try every tactic, emotional, financial, even legal, but I would not be erased. If they wanted to turn me into a case, a burden, a signature on a paper, they would find out what resistance looks like when it wears the face of a mother who has nothing left to lose. The next morning I called my lawyer and began the first of many quiet preparations. I no longer felt fear, only purpose. Betrayal had burned away the last illusions of family loyalty, leaving behind something purer, resolve. And though I didn't know how far they were willing to go, I knew one thing for certain: they had just declared war on the wrong woman. The night after that confrontation, I didn't sleep. I sat by the kitchen window until dawn, the city's streetlights fading one by one, as if the world itself were exhaling after holding its breath. I felt the familiar ache of exhaustion, but beneath it was something sharper, a current of clarity that refused to fade. For the first time in years, I was done reacting. It was time to act. At sunrise, I made the first of 3 phone calls. The first was to Samuel Grant, my financial advisor of nearly 15 years. He had known both me and Richard since the early days of our company, and his loyalty was earned, not bought. When he answered, I could hear surprise in his voice. It wasn't often I called him before 8. "Samuel," I said, my tone steady, "I need you to prepare everything: my accounts, property titles, the trust papers, and the safety deposit records. I want full documentation, certified copies. And bring the brown folder from my file cabinet." He hesitated only a second before replying, "Understood. Are we expecting trouble?" "We're expecting clarity," I answered, repeating the same words I'd told him months earlier. My second call was to Mr. Weber, a lawyer who specialized in elder rights. I'd heard about him from my friend Marion, the broker. He was the kind of man who believed that dignity was a legal matter as much as a moral one. I told him I wanted to update my will, secure power of attorney restrictions, and establish a clear record of my cognitive capacity. He agreed to meet me later that week, his tone respectful, not patronizing a rarity when one reaches a certain age. The third call was the hardest. I dialed the number of my neighbor, Eleanor Brooks, a retired nurse who had lived across the hall for over 20 years. She was kind, practical, and above all, observant. "Eleanor," I said softly, "if you see anyone around my apartment who doesn't belong, please let me know immediately. Especially if it's my son or his wife." There was a pause on the line before she said, "You don't have to explain, dear. I've seen the way they talk to you. I'll keep watch." Her quiet solidarity made my throat tighten. That afternoon, Samuel arrived. The brown folder lay on his lap as we sat at the dining table. Its contents represented the hidden architecture of my life: certificates, investment reports, ownership deeds. There were copies of transactions Eric never knew existed, including records of the monthly transfers I'd sent him for 3 years, $4,300 each month, totaling $155,000. "You've been generous," Samuel said carefully. "Too generous," I corrected. I looked at the numbers printed in clean black ink and felt nothing but resolve. "We're cutting all support immediately. Prepare the termination notices and redirect my accounts into a secured trust under my name only." He nodded, his face grave. "And the assets?" "Everything stays consolidated. I want documentation showing that all major holdings, the office building, the lake house, the investments remain untouched. If anyone tries to move against me, I want a paper wall they can't climb." As he worked through the papers, I felt the fatigue of years lifting like dust in sunlight. The numbers no longer frightened me, they empowered me. They were proof of a lifetime of effort that no one could take by deceit or manipulation. For decades, I had been the quiet caretaker of my own stability, and now it was time to defend it not with anger, but with precision. When Samuel left, the folder remained on my table, heavier somehow now that I understood its purpose. I made tea and sat with it, running my hand over the worn leather. It smelled faintly of cedar, the way Richard's study once did. In that moment, I felt him with me again. He had always said, "Paper is power, Eleanor, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that endures." That evening, I went through the house like a soldier inspecting a fortress. I tested the locks, organized files, and replaced the passcode on my safe. Every step was deliberate. I was no longer the woman waiting for respect. I was the woman reclaiming control. I contacted a small security company owned by 2 local veterans, Mr. Summers and his nephew Ethan, who specialized in home surveillance. Within a day, cameras would be installed discreetly, linked directly to my phone and to a secure cloud storage Samuel would manage. The process gave me a strange sense of peace. There's something deeply empowering about reclaiming the right to one's own safety. The more I worked, the less afraid I became. For years, I had told myself that love required forgiveness, that patience was virtue. But love without boundaries is a form of self-erasure. I had allowed Eric and Sabrina to mistake my silence for consent, my compassion for weakness. Those days were over. 2 nights later, Weber visited. He brought with him a stack of legal documents that glowed under the lamplight like quiet weapons. He explained each in measured detail: the trust revisions, the health directive, the affidavit of competence signed by a licensed psychologist. "If they ever try to claim you're unfit," he said, "this record will bury that claim before it reaches court." He paused before adding, "They'll have no legal standing over your assets or medical choices. You're untouchable now." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, though not from sadness. It was the tear of someone who had finally remembered her own worth. "Thank you, Mr. Weber," I whispered. "This means more than you know." He smiled kindly. "Mrs. Parker, you'd be surprised how many of my clients are women like you, brilliant, capable, generous, who have to fight for the right to be believed. But you're ahead of most. You saw it coming." After he left, I sat in the stillness of my home, surrounded by the quiet hum of security cameras and the scent of chamomile tea. I thought of Eric as a little boy, sitting on this same table doing homework, his forehead wrinkled in concentration. How did we arrive here from bedtime stories to legal protection orders? I wanted to blame Sabrina entirely, but deep down I knew Eric had made his own choices. Love had blinded me once. Now it only guided me to truth. That night I wrote in my journal, "They will try again, but next time they won't find an open door. They'll find a wall made of evidence." The next morning, as sunlight touched the windows, I called Samuel again. "Everything's in place," he confirmed. "Would you like me to file the property freeze notices as well?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Let's make sure every piece of this life stays where it belongs." When I hung up, I exhaled deeply. The world felt lighter not because it had become kinder, but because I had stopped waiting for it to be. I was no longer the woman hoping to be spared betrayal. I was the woman who had turned betrayal into a boundary. Outside, the city began to stir, the hum of cars rising like distant applause. I looked out over the skyline, feeling a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The battle had already started, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing. Because when you've spent a lifetime building something with your bare hands, you learn the most valuable truth of all. No one can take from you what you've already decided to protect. The ballroom smelled of roses and champagne, yet beneath it all lingered the faint odor of something sour: entitlement, perhaps, or the arrogance of youth. I stood near the entrance, my hands clasped around the small brown folder Samuel had brought me earlier that evening. My pulse was calm, almost unnervingly so. I had imagined this moment for weeks, rehearsing every word until it felt like breathing. Tonight would not be another humiliation. Tonight, truth would take the stage. The chandelier's light fell over satin gowns and tuxedos, glittering glasses and false smiles. Sabrina was radiant in her gown, every diamond on her neck reflecting the attention she craved. Eric stood beside her, trying to appear confident, though his eyes betrayed unease. I wondered if somewhere inside him, a part of the son I raised still existed, a part that remembered decency, gratitude, love. But when his gaze met mine, he looked away. That answer was enough. As the orchestra began its soft prelude, Sabrina took the microphone to thank the guests. Her voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who believed the world existed for her convenience. "We are so grateful to everyone who made this evening possible," she said, glancing at Eric before continuing, "especially my in-laws, who taught us the value of family and generosity." The words dripped with irony. Around her, guests nodded approvingly, oblivious to the venom laced beneath the sweetness. That was when I stepped forward. I hadn't planned to interrupt her, but the moment demanded it. My heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the music until even the orchestra stopped playing. A hush fell over the room. Sabrina blinked in confusion as I approached, the brown folder in my hand like a verdict. "Forgive me for intruding," I said, my voice clear, unwavering. "But since we're speaking of generosity, perhaps we should discuss what it truly means." There was a ripple of discomfort, a few nervous laughs. Sabrina's smile faltered. "Eleanor, perhaps we can do this later," she began, but I raised my hand. "No, dear. Later is what you say when you want the truth to go away." I turned to the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. For 3 years, I have quietly supported my son and his wife. Not out of obligation, but out of love. Every month, $4,300 was deposited into their account. I paid their rent, their car, their medical bills. I even guaranteed this wedding $51,000 in advance. Gasps broke out among the guests. The color drained from Sabrina's face. Eric's lips parted in shock, as if he hadn't believed I would ever speak out. I opened the folder, showing the documents, bank statements, receipts, signatures. "This," I said, "is what generosity looks like, silent, consistent, and unseen." My voice softened, but my gaze did not. "And this," I added, looking directly at Sabrina, "is what betrayal looks like, public, loud, and shameless." Someone in the crowd whispered, "Is this real?" I turned slightly toward the voice. Every number, every date, every transaction real. I could feel the room shifting, empathy replacing curiosity, judgment turning toward the glittering couple at the center. Sabrina's mask cracked. "You're ruining our wedding," she hissed, her voice trembling. I met her fury with calm. "No, Sabrina, I'm reclaiming my name. You did that the moment you slapped me for not handing over my home. You made it public. I'm only finishing the story." My words carried through the hall like a bell. Then I gestured to Samuel, who stood quietly near the edge of the crowd. He stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and handed me a series of signed letters. I read them aloud. Effective immediately, the Parker Family Trust is revised. All financial guarantees provided to Eric and Sabrina are terminated. The wedding guarantee is void. The condominium, previously discussed for transfer, remains my sole property, and any attempt to claim ownership will be treated as fraud. A wave of murmurs swept through the guests. Cameras flashed. Someone was recording. I could see the faint glow of a phone in the back of the room. The same technology that had captured my humiliation would now record my restoration. Sabrina took a step forward, her voice breaking into hysteria. "You can't just embarrass us like this. Everyone here," I interrupted, "should understand that kindness without limits breeds cruelty. I spent a lifetime believing patience would protect me. Tonight, I learned that patience without boundaries only feeds predators." Eric tried to intervene then, reaching for my arm. "Mom, please, this isn't the place." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the garden, who once promised never to make me cry. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man too afraid to stand beside truth. "No, Eric," I said quietly, "this is exactly the place. You let her strike me here. You let her call me selfish in front of everyone I knew, so I will let the same room witness what real selfishness looks like." He lowered his head. The silence between us was a chasm that could never be crossed again. When I finished speaking, I placed the documents on the nearest table and turned to leave. But before I could take a step, someone began to clap. It started softly, one guest, then another, until the sound grew into a reluctant, scattered applause. It wasn't approval, it was acknowledgement. They knew what they had witnessed was not cruelty but courage. As I walked toward the exit, I passed Sabrina's mother, Mrs. Grant, who looked pale and stunned. "You could have handled this privately," she muttered. I paused just long enough to reply, "So could she." Then I continued walking, my heels echoing in rhythm with the applause that still hung in the air. Outside, the cool night embraced me. The fountain lights shimmered across the courtyard, reflecting the calm I felt within. For the first time in years, I wasn't pretending to be smaller than I was. The truth had cost me peace once. Tonight, it bought it back. Samuel caught up with me at the car. "You did what needed to be done," he said quietly. "They won't recover from this." I looked up at the glowing windows of the ballroom, where laughter was forced and brittle now. "Good," I said softly. "Maybe now they'll understand the difference between inheritance and respect." As we drove away, I felt something strange, neither triumph nor sorrow, but freedom, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking to be seen, the kind that doesn't need forgiveness to move on. Behind me, the music started again, desperate and hollow, as if trying to erase what had just happened, but some echoes don't fade. They become a part of you, proof that even in a room full of noise, one quiet voice, spoken with conviction, can change everything. That night, I placed the brown folder back on my shelf, beside Richard's photograph. The same folder that once held numbers now held something greater, truth. I touched the frame and whispered, "You were right, my love. Power isn't loud, it's steady." Then I turned off the lights and let the silence settle around me, no longer heavy, but earned. 3 days after the wedding, silence filled my apartment like a presence of its own, dense, heavy, unrelenting. The same walls that had once absorbed laughter and shared meals now seemed to echo with absence. I sat at my kitchen table, the brown folder before me, untouched since that night. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window, and for the first time in years, I didn't rush to meet the day. I let the quiet hold me. I had exposed the truth, stripped the lies, and left the ballroom with my dignity intact. Yet even justice carries a strange kind of loneliness. By the second morning, the phone began to ring. The first call was from Eric. I didn't answer. Then came another, and another, 37 in total over 2 days, each message more desperate than the last. His voice shifted through stages. Disbelief, anger, guilt, pleading. "Mom, please pick up. You've made your point, but you can't leave us like this. Sabrina's devastated. We just need time to fix everything." Fix. That word made me pause every time. How do you fix a fracture born of greed? How do you repair something that was built on deception? The text messages from Sabrina were worse. Her words were venom disguised as apology. You humiliated us, but I understand you were emotional. Let's talk before things go too far. By the fifth message, she had switched to threats. If you don't undo what you did, we'll have no choice but to take legal action. You're not in your right mind, Eleanor. I deleted every message, but not before forwarding them to my lawyer. Mr. Weber replied within the hour. Keep everything. It may prove important later. Their desperation wasn't surprising. The legal wheels had already begun turning. Samuel called on the third morning to confirm what I had expected. They've been served notice. The landlord rescinded their lease, the wedding venue filed for payment, and the credit cards have been suspended. They're in over their heads. I took a long breath. Then it's begun, I said softly. Yes, he replied, and they have no one left to blame but themselves. That afternoon, Eleanor, my neighbor, knocked on the door. She carried a small tray of muffins and the kind of compassion that didn't need words. You did what every mother dreams of having the courage to do, she said simply. You set boundaries. I smiled faintly, grateful for her presence. It doesn't feel like courage, I admitted. It feels like mourning, she nodded. That's because it is. You're grieving the illusion of who they were. 2 days later, I received an unexpected visit. Lucy, my niece, stood at my doorstep, her eyes red from crying. Behind her were two familiar faces, Amelia, the real estate broker who had once helped me with my husband's investments, and Joseph, my longtime neighbor and friend. Their expressions were a mix of urgency and concern. Aunt Eleanor, Lucy said as she stepped inside, there's something you need to see. She handed me a folder thinner than the one I had carried into the ballroom, but far heavier in consequence. Amelia spoke first. I've been digging into Eric and Sabrina's finances since the wedding night. I wanted to make sure there were no hidden surprises that could come back to you. Her voice faltered. What I found goes far beyond simple debt. She spread the documents across the table. Emails, legal drafts, and confidential notes. They've been planning to declare you legally incompetent. The groundwork started months ago, consultations with attorneys, forged medical inquiries, even drafted petitions claiming you were unfit to handle your own affairs. My breath caught. For a moment the world tilted slightly. Lucy reached for my hand. They weren't just trying to take your apartment, she said softly. They were trying to take everything. Joseph, who had remained quiet until then, added, I overheard Sabrina that night after the wedding. She was on the phone, furious, saying, she ruined everything, but Plan B will take care of it. His words hit me like a slap. Plan B? I repeated. He nodded grimly. She didn't say what it was, but she sounded desperate. The room fell silent. The rain outside had turned heavier, striking the windows in hard, uneven rhythms. It felt as if the world itself had decided to echo the chaos they had unleashed. I leaned back in my chair and looked at each of them. They're not finished, I said finally. They're wounded, cornered, and dangerous, but they forget I've lived long enough to see the shape of betrayal before it strikes. At that moment, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Samuel stood there, his face drawn and serious. Eleanor, he said, I'm afraid the rumors are true. Eric filed a preliminary petition this morning, claiming you're mentally unstable. He's alleging that your actions at the wedding were the result of cognitive decline. My heart sank, but my resolve held. On what evidence? I asked. Sworn statements, he said grimly, from several wedding guests who claim you had an emotional outburst, that you were confused, unstable. Sabrina's mother signed one of them. Lucy's hand tightened around mine. They're twisting everything, she whispered. I nodded slowly. Of course they are. They always have. Samuel continued. We'll respond formally, of course. The documentation you signed last week, the psychological evaluation, the cognitive assessment, the revised will, all of that protects you. But we'll need to be strategic. The court of law isn't always the same as the court of public opinion. I looked at him sharply. Then we'll use both. Amelia leaned forward, a sudden glimmer of defiance lighting her eyes. Actually, something's already working in your favor." She turned her phone toward me. On the screen, I saw a video one recorded at the wedding. It was the moment I confronted Sabrina, the moment I stood my ground. The caption read, "Elderly woman fights back against greedy family at her son's wedding." It had over 1 million views. As the clip played, the comments scrolled faster than I could read. "She's a legend." Finally, someone stood up for herself. "My mom went through this too. Thank you for speaking truth." I felt my throat tighten. Joseph smiled faintly. "The world saw what happened, Eleanor. You're not the villain they're trying to make you. You're the proof that silence doesn't mean weakness." For the first time in weeks, I laughed a sound that felt like freedom itself. "So they wanted a public battle," I said. "They'll have one, but it won't be the kind they expect." That night, I opened my journal and wrote a single line. "If they want war, they'll get it, but fought with evidence, not emotion, with truth, not tears." When I finished, I poured myself a cup of tea and looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of renewal. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the promise of reckoning. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel fear. I felt ready. 6 months passed like a long winter thawing slowly into light. When I looked back, the events of that night, the slap, the confrontation, the betrayal felt both distant and permanent, etched into my bones like old scars that no longer hurt but would never fully fade. Life had changed in ways I could not have imagined. What began as a private wound had become a public reckoning. The story of an old woman standing up to greed had traveled farther than I ever dreamed. And now, sitting in a television studio under bright white lights, I was about to tell it again, not out of vanity, but out of purpose. The show was called Stories of Courage, hosted by Catherine Diaz, a journalist whose calm intelligence and integrity had earned her the trust of millions. She had reached out after the wedding videos went viral, 2 million views in less than a week. At first, I refused. I wasn't interested in fame or pity. But when letters began arriving from women across the country, widows, retirees, mothers, each describing their own battles against financial manipulation by family, I knew I couldn't stay silent. If my voice had found an audience, it had to be used for something greater than my pain. The studio was cool, sterile, almost unreal. Cameras faced me like silent witnesses. I wore a simple navy dress and a small brooch that had once belonged to Richard. Samuel sat beside me, his calm presence steadying my nerves. In the audience were Lucy, Joseph, and Amelia, my truest allies, each of them a living reminder that family is not always written in blood, but in loyalty. Catherine smiled at me as the producer counted down. "We're live in 5, someone called. The red light blinked on, and she began. "Good evening, and welcome to Stories of Courage. Tonight, we bring you a story that has resonated with millions, a story of betrayal, resilience, and the unbreakable strength of a woman who refused to be silenced." She turned to me. "Mrs. Eleanor Parker, thank you for being here." I smiled faintly. "Thank you for giving me a voice." She leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, millions of people have seen the footage from your son's wedding. The world watched as you exposed years of manipulation and took back your dignity. How does it feel to know that your story has inspired so many?" The question settled in the air, simple but profound. "It feels humbling," I said. "When I walked into that ballroom, I didn't do it to inspire anyone. I did it because I had reached my limit. I was tired of pretending that cruelty wrapped in family ties was something I had to endure, but seeing the response, the letters, the messages, it made me realize that I wasn't alone. There are so many of us who've been made to feel small for simply wanting respect." Catherine nodded, her eyes softening. "You've turned something deeply painful into a kind of movement. What gave you the courage to do that?" I thought for a moment before answering. Perhaps courage isn't something you find, it's what remains when everything else is taken. I lost my son's trust, my peace, my illusion of family. What I had left was truth, and once you hold truth in your hands, you realize it's the only thing that weighs less than regret. The room was quiet, even the crew seemed still. Then Catherine continued. "Since the wedding, there's been a legal battle, hasn't there?" "Yes," I said, Eric and Sabrina filed a petition claiming I was mentally incompetent. They tried to use that night as proof of instability, but we had prepared for that. Mr. Weber, my attorney, presented evidence, medical evaluations, witness testimonies, even financial records showing how long they'd been planning their scheme. The case collapsed in weeks. The court not only dismissed their claim but ordered them to pay all legal fees. Catherine's eyebrows lifted slightly. That must have been vindicating. It was bittersweet, I admitted. Justice doesn't erase pain, it only affirms it was real. Samuel leaned toward his microphone. What Mrs. Parker isn't saying is that her case set a precedent in elder rights law. It's now cited in ongoing legal training as an example of how to defend seniors from familial financial coercion. Applause rose from the audience, soft but sincere. I smiled, a mixture of pride and disbelief washing over me. Catherine waited for the applause to fade. What message would you give to those watching who might be living a similar situation but are too afraid to act? I looked directly into the camera, imagining the faces of the people who had written to me, the widows signing over houses they built with their own hands, the grandparents who were made to feel like burdens, the quiet, invisible pain of being treated as disposable. To anyone watching who feels trapped by guilt or fear, I want to say this: love does not require your surrender. You can care for your family without sacrificing your dignity. You have the right to say no. You have the right to keep what you built. You have the right to be respected. Catherine nodded, visibly moved. That's powerful. The interview continued for nearly an hour. We spoke of the Aurora Hughes Foundation, the organization I had founded using a portion of my redirected inheritance. Its mission was simple: to protect seniors from family abuse and help them rebuild their lives with legal, emotional, and financial support. We've helped more than 400 people in the past 6 months, I said proudly. Some recover property, others simply recover their confidence. Either way, they walk away knowing they're not alone. Samuel added, "It's extraordinary. What started as one woman's stand has become a national conversation." When the cameras finally turned off, Catherine rose from her chair and hugged me. "That was one of the most profound interviews I've ever done," she said quietly. "You didn't just tell a story, you gave people permission to fight back." As the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, I sat for a moment longer, absorbing the quiet. Outside the glass windows, the city glowed like a constellation of second chances. Joseph waved from the hallway. Lucy's eyes shimmered with pride, and Amelia squeezed my shoulder as we walked out together. That night, back in my apartment, I poured a cup of tea and sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool, the stars faint but steady. My phone buzzed a message from a number I hadn't seen in months. It was from Eric. "Mom, I saw the interview. I don't know what to say." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a familiar ache rise and fall. Finally, I typed, "You don't have to say anything yet. Just live differently." Then I put the phone down. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes as the sounds of the city drifted upward. I thought of the hundreds of letters I'd received, the people who had found hope through my pain, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving betrayal with your heart still open. The wound was still there, yes, but it had become something else, a doorway. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not because everything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for someone else to make it right. Sometimes healing isn't reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply choosing to live fully, even when love fails to return the way you gave it. 2 years have passed since that night that divided my life into a before and an after. I often think of it as the night I was born again, though I was 69 at the time. Rebirth has little to do with age and everything to do with courage. Now, at 71, I sit on my balcony surrounded by the soft hum of the city, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. The same view that once looked gray and distant now feels alive, every window a reminder that I chose to live freely, on my own terms. Each morning begins the same way. At 8, Carmen calls from the Aurora Parker Foundation, the organization I built from the wreckage of my old life. "We have 14 new cases this week," she says, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "Mostly widows and retirees, Similar stories, children pressuring parents to sell their homes or transfer assets. Every story she tells me feels like an echo of my past, each one a reflection of what I once endured. Yet instead of despair, I feel purpose. Pain, when shared, becomes something else, a blueprint for survival. The foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined. What started in a small rented office is now a network spanning 3 cities. We have lawyers, social workers, and counselors who dedicate their days to helping seniors recover what was stolen: money, homes, self-respect. So far, we've helped over 400 people reclaim control over their lives. We've won back houses signed away under pressure, exposed fraudulent guardianships, and helped families rebuild after years of manipulation. Every victory, big or small, feels like a promise kept to the woman I used to be, the one who once trembled in silence. Joseph is still by my side. Once my neighbor, now the foundation's vice president, he's become my closest confidant. His laugh fills the halls during our meetings, his patience grounding the team when cases become overwhelming. "I never thought retirement would mean chasing lawyers and catching liars," he jokes, "but I wouldn't trade this for anything." Watching him thrive gives me joy I didn't expect to feel again. It reminds me that healing doesn't only belong to the young, it belongs to anyone brave enough to keep growing. Lucy moved into the apartment next door last year. After leaving a brief, unhappy marriage, she decided she wanted a life with meaning, not comfort. She now heads our education program, teaching workshops on financial literacy and emotional boundaries for older adults. "Aunt Eleanor," she tells me, "you taught me that respect has to start at home with yourself." When I watch her lead those sessions, her voice calm but powerful, I see the continuation of something larger than both of us, a generational bridge built not from inheritance but from wisdom. The greatest surprise of all came from the book I never intended to write. With the help of an investigative journalist, I documented everything: the manipulation, the betrayal, the recovery, and the birth of the foundation. When Love Hurts, An Older Woman Fights Back became a national bestseller, selling more than 200,000 copies. The royalties fund our operations entirely, turning pain into possibility. Every letter I receive from a reader is proof that the story reached exactly who it needed to. "You gave me strength to speak up," one woman wrote. "I thought no one would believe me. Now I know I deserve to be heard." Samuel, my steadfast advisor, remains the quiet force behind every success. He manages our finances, mentors young attorneys, and reminds me, often, that reason and empathy can coexist. "You've created something that will outlast all of us," he told me recently. "You turned one night of humiliation into a lifetime of protection for others." Hearing that still brings tears to my eyes, not from pride, but from gratitude. People often ask if I miss my son. The truth is complicated. I miss the child he once was, the little boy who used to fall asleep on my lap, the teenager who brought me wildflowers from the yard. But I don't miss the man who saw me as an obstacle rather than a mother. Love doesn't vanish, but it changes shape. It becomes quieter, more protective of itself. Eric tried to reach out 3 times in 2 years. The first time, after losing the legal case, he asked for money to start over. The second time, when his child was born, he said, "You have a grandson now, you owe it to him to make peace." The third time, when his marriage fell apart, he called at midnight, his voice brittle with exhaustion. "Mom, your pride is destroying us." I remember my own voice, calm but firm. "No, Eric, my pride is what saved me." It's the line that taught me where love ends and self-respect begins. It was the first time I hung up on my son, and strangely, it was also the first night I slept without dreams. Still, when I think of my grandson, Oliver, my heart softens. He is 18 months old now, living somewhere in the suburbs with his mother. I've never met him, though I've set aside a trust fund for his education. For Oliver, when he turns 18, the note inside reads, "May he inherit the courage his father lost. Amelia, my dear friend and real estate ally, believes that someday he'll come looking for answers. When he's old enough to ask what happened," she says, "he'll find the truth in you." I hope she's right. The idea that the next generation might learn from the past keeps me hopeful. My health, once fragile, has flourished with peace. My doctor, Dr. Hernandez, told me recently that my blood pressure and heart are as strong as a woman 10 years younger. It's remarkable, he said. It's as if you've been carrying a weight for years and now it's gone. I smiled and replied, "It's not gone, doctor, it's transformed. The absence of fear has done what medicine never could. I sleep deeply now. I wake with purpose. The tremor that once haunted my hands is gone. These days I spend my weekends at the community garden behind the foundation's main office. I teach seniors how to grow herbs and medicinal plants, lavender, rosemary, mint. I tell them that tending to something alive teaches you patience and faith in cycles, that what looks like loss is often just a pause before regrowth. We laugh, we share stories, and sometimes, in quiet moments, I catch them watching me with the same look I once gave women I admired. The recognition of shared survival. In 2 weeks, I will travel to Washington to meet with senators drafting new legislation to protect seniors from financial coercion. The Eleanor Parker Foundation has been invited to consult. When I received the letter, I cried not out of vanity, but because I understood what it meant, that a single voice, when steady enough, can move mountains of silence. At night, before bed, I often revisit the woman I was the night of the wedding, the one who stood in that ballroom, trembling but defiant, holding her folder like a shield. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her, "You were right to walk away. You were right to fight back. What felt like loss was the beginning of freedom." The city lights flicker below as I write these words. Tomorrow will bring more calls, more cases, more battles to fight, but I no longer see them as burdens. They're reminders that what I endured had meaning. That the story I once thought would end in shame became a blueprint for others to find their strength. If anyone were to ask me now what I've learned, I'd say this: it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. It's never too late to start again. Sometimes, the only way to save a relationship is to let it go, to build something new from its ashes. And sometimes, the most powerful word a woman can say, after a lifetime of being silenced, is the simplest one of all: enough. In the end, Eleanor Parker's story was never just about betrayal, it was about awakening. What began as a mother's heartbreak evolved into a powerful testament of courage, self-respect, and renewal. She had spent decades believing that patience was love and that silence was protection. But when her kindness was mistaken for weakness, she discovered something far greater than forgiveness. She discovered the strength of boundaries. Through the quiet precision of her choices, Eleanor transformed humiliation into justice and pain into purpose. Her journey reminds us that dignity doesn't fade with age, it deepens when we decide to defend it. Her decision to turn her personal ordeal into the Eleanor Parker Foundation was not only an act of resilience, but also a declaration that survival can be shared. By helping other seniors protect their rights and reclaim their voices, she gave meaning to what once felt unbearable. She didn't let bitterness define her, she turned it into legacy. In doing so, Eleanor became the voice of a generation too often dismissed, too often silenced, and too often forgotten. Her story teaches us that it's never too late to rebuild your life, to draw a line where love ends and self-respect begins, and to understand that family is not defined by blood, but by behavior. The deeper lesson is simple yet profound. Peace is not given, it's claimed. The courage to stand up for yourself, even when it means standing alone, is the truest form of love you can offer to yourself first, and then to others. Eleanor's story calls us to look inward and ask, where in my life have I allowed kindness to be mistaken for surrender? Because every time we reclaim our worth, we remind the world that compassion and strength can exist in the same heart. In our modern world where elder voices are often ignored and loyalty is too easily traded for convenience, Eleanor's message is a compass. It urges us to prepare, to protect, and to believe that self-respect is not selfish, it's sacred. Whether you're 70 or 17, her story shows that healing begins the moment you choose clarity over comfort and boundaries over guilt. What about you? Do you believe forgiveness means giving another chance or setting yourself free? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective and learn from one another. And if Eleanor's story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and stay with us for more stories of resilience, justice, and second chances. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating meaningful stories that remind us all it's never too late to start again.